This boy needed help now. Lila Carter, waitress, dropped a tray and moved before anyone else could name what was happening. It was late afternoon in the glass-faced dining room of the Marlowe, a downtown bistro where suits and strollers shared the same tables, and the sun slanted like an accusation across the laminate. A high chair thudded against tile. The child sat limp, skin gray under the skin of his chin, eyes unfocused as if the world were a painting someone else had hung in the distance. His small hand did not reach for the spoon. Lila had seen enough bodies and enough bruises to know that bodies speak before people do. She felt the air go thin, like someone had sucked the breath out of the room. Speech slurred, eyelid falling, a hand that would not lift. Around them, forks scraped, a radio hummed a tired jazz line. Coffee steam cut through the soft light. The father, rich in a way that smelled like new leather and cold cash, waved a card and a smile and said, "Leave us be." He said, "Keep calm, we have people for this." Lila looked at the man in an expensive suit and saw not authority but something brittle. She reached for the child before permission could be negotiated. What followed would set a town arguing over privilege and responsibility and would force a chain of people to look at a simple truth: seeing matters. The scene unfolded in the narrow artery between booth 4 and the open kitchen. Sensory details landed like small knocks. The smell of lemon polish hung with the scent of fries. Heat rose from the griddle in brief waves across Lila's forearms. The child smelled faintly of milk and something metallic. The cutlery chimed like small bells. Her shoes squeaked on tiles worn smooth by 1,000 shifts. She crouched and felt the child's forehead burn against the back of her hand. "He is not just sleepy," Lila said, voice tight. "He is not responding on the left." Rosa, another server, hovered by, apron sticking damp to her back. Manager Denise approached, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for liability. "Sir, we need to call an ambulance," Denise said. Marcus Thompson did not move at first. He set his jaw in a rehearsed way and said, "We will take him to our private doctor. No need to alarm the room." Lila answered before she could tally the risk and the cost. "No, he is showing focal signs. Please let me call now." For a second, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the child's breath coming shallow and fast. The father held out a hand with a credit card like a barrier. "This is my son," he said flatly. The room split between people who pretended not to see and people whose faces had suddenly made room for panic. Lila did not back down. The first fallout came as a decision that felt like a lock snapping closed. The manager hesitated, not because she was unmoved, but because of the father and the diner of patrons whose images were already online. A regular called out without looking, "Is this another show?" The wealthy father insisted on his plan. A server named Rosa pressed her palms together, whispering, "What do we do?" Lila felt the system tighten. In one corner, a man in a navy blazer made a call with slow fingers. On the other, 2 mothers pushed their strollers back as if to create a buffer. The social calculus became brutal in minutes. Lila had to choose between the policy and the pulse under the child's ribs. She made the choice that would cost her a night and win a life. "I am a first responder in training," she told Denise, who frowned at the phrasing. "Let me run a rapid assessment. If I say it is urgent, we book the ambulance now." Denise shifted weight and then nodded, because sometimes even managers know the cost of being wrong. Marcus folded his hands, the expensive leather creaking like permission. The refraction of this moment moved outward fast. Someone snapped a photo with a phone, and the image slid into 1,000 palm screens. Gossip became a force, tangling with power. The father yelled, voice thick with the assumption that money bought discretion, "Do not make a scene." The cook, Luis, stopped at the pass and watched like a referee. Officer Ramirez happened to be eating in a corner booth and answered when someone flagged him. He took a breath and said, "Sir, if the child is unresponsive, we can take him to the hospital now." The father said no, that they would go in their car, that this was not an emergency. Lila heard it as deflection. She remembered a class where a pediatric neurologist had said small asymmetries can be the beginning of collapse. She remembered the hollow feeling when her own brother had been dismissed by an urgent care and then slipped into a coma days later.
Lila had a history with being ignored, and she would not be that woman again. She found a quiet corner in her head and opened the backstory that formed why she could not look away. She was born in a hospital 3 blocks from this corner, the child of a mother who worked 2 cleaning shifts and a father who drove a cab. Her childhood smelled of bleach and instant coffee and the faint metallic tang of worry. In the neighborhood clinic, she had watched nurses move with the certainty of people who have seen the same injury 100 times and have learned how to calm the world. She had apprenticed as a home health aide for a year at 19, learning how to measure pulse without a monitor and how to make a patient feel seen. Age 15, she lost her younger brother Jerome to a late diagnosis of bacterial meningitis that several doctors had misread as a viral fever. He had dropped words and then movement and then disappeared from the family table. That loss hardened into a quiet current of determination. She took night classes and earned a basic first aid certificate. She kept a small notebook in her back pocket with notes on seizure presentations and airway positions. When she touched the child's scalp that afternoon, memory came like a flavor. She could still hear Jerome laughing through a cracked bedroom window on a summer evening. She had promised herself then that she would not let another parent say "not yet" when their child needed now. That oath was not about fame. It was about an unglamorous, stubborn kind of duty. The backstory stretched. The teenage job at a senior living center had taught her how to report subtle declines, how to be firm with doctors who were tired, and how to document things in handwriting that could later be read. Her education had been interrupted when she had to support her mother after a layoff. She returned to school in her late 20s while juggling weekend shifts. The training was never complete, but it gave her eyes. It taught her that the body speaks in small betrayals before it screams. The memory of Jerome and the dozens of nights of study shaped the shape of her courage. Her apron had a coffee stain the color of old paper and a pen tucked into the strap. Those small objects were the talismans of someone who had chosen to see. She carried the wound of loss and the skill it had produced in equal measure. When witnesses later asked why she had insisted, she would say simply, "Because I learned to read the quiet parts." At the moment she decided to act, the restaurant became a theater of commerce and conscience. Lila dialed 911 and spoke with a calm cultivated from training. "Child with focal neurological signs," she said. "Left-sided weakness, drooping eyelid, slurred speech. Need ambulance immediately." The dispatcher asked routine questions. The tone was practice, but the voice on the line could not deny urgency. Manager Denise argued under her breath about liability and public image, but she stepped back when the paramedics called to confirm an ETA. Marcus Thompson called his assistant Janelle Park and demanded that they take their son to the clinic where his personal doctor waited rather than an ambulance. Lila overheard and felt the old geometry of power tighten. She did not yell. She did not say please. She repeated what any clinician would measure: airway open, breathing shallow, circulation present but weak, pupils unequal. The call changed behaviors. A paramedic unit was diverted and timed like a small mercy. The ambulance siren was distant at first and then a braid of sound that unraveled into the street outside. Lila breathed against the smell of lemon and grease and watched the man she had helped enter a temporary world where his money
meant little, and the child's small body meant everything. If this story hits you, if you feel that twinge of anger and hope together, please comment below with the city you are watching from and a 2-word reaction. Tell us if you have ever tried to intervene and what happened. Your comments matter because they map how communities act when systems hesitate. When people share their experiences, we build a texture of evidence that can push institutions to change. One voice is a spark. Many voices can become a signal that is hard to ignore. Now, continue with what happened after she refused to let the child be left in the corner of convenience. The other side of the conflict also needed a face. Marcus Thompson sat in a car that smelled faintly of cedar and cologne, fingers tapping on a leather steering wheel like a metronome. He had built his life on efficiency, influence, and a belief that problems yielded to money and decisive private intervention. His assistant, Janelle Park, sat opposite him and read a fingertip-smudged page on a tablet. "We have a private pediatrician 2 blocks away," she said, voice low. "We can be out of here in 7 minutes." Marcus felt annoyance like a pressure behind his eyes. He thought first of exposure, of tabloids, of a face on a screen that would undo the careful distance he had constructed around his family. He told himself that rushing to a private clinic was not privilege but prudence. Call Dr. Weaver and tell him we are coming. Do not let anyone take him in an ambulance. I will not have strangers post this. Janelle typed quickly and felt a small prickle of indecision. She had seen the boy's hand not respond when his father lifted it. She had seen the child's breath quicken through her window. She wanted to trust Marcus because that was her job, but she also had a sister whose child had been misdiagnosed because a busy clinic rushed a test. The room between loyalty and conscience felt narrow. The ambulance arrived with a controlled thunder. Paramedics Caleb and Nina moved through the restaurant with practiced brevity. Caleb's hands smelled faintly of disinfectant. Nina's voice was a calm instrument tuned to the frequency of crisis. "Where is the patient?" she asked, and all the small sounds in the room hissed into silence. Lila pointed. For the next 10 minutes, the scene was clinical and intimate. There were direct exchanges that laid out priorities. "We have unequal pupils and right-sided drift," Caleb said aloud, checking pulses. "Airway is patent, we will oxygenate." Nina ordered a small oxygen mask and placed it gently on the child's face while asking for history. "When did this start?" she asked the father. Marcus said an hour ago they had been at the country club and his son complained of not feeling well. "Right. We are not leaving him here in an ambulance," Marcus said. Caleb looked at Marcus with a patient expression and said, "Sir, we are trained for this. Time is brained with focal neurological deficits." The father countered with wealth and with fear. "I will take him in my car to Dr. Weaver," he replied. The paramedics repeated their dictum, but they also had to protect the child and respect the family's wishes. Caleb and Nina worked in compact sentences and swift hands, a choreography of urgency. In the stretcher, the child was secured, his small body tucked with caution. The sirens stitched through traffic, and the city smelled of hot pavement and exhaust as they cut a path toward the nearest trauma center. In the ambulance, the sensory details deepened. The fluorescent strip lights hummed above like insects. The plastic of the stretcher was cool under the child's back. A monitor beeped with a shallow regularity, and the smell of antiseptic grazed the back of Lila's throat as she sat in the passenger seat with lungs filled with a new tempo. There were 12 exchanges between the paramedic team and the ER by radio as they announced a potential pediatric stroke. She heard the dispatcher say, "Prepare CT and a neurologist on call." The radio voice used words like priority and code and ETA. The team spoke clearly and often, 10 to 14 concise lines, the same density that markers of main scenes required. They described breathing patterns, and one paramedic explained that they had applied oxygen and checked blood sugar, that the child's glucose was normal. They talked about the duration of symptoms and how they could not wait for a private appointment. Each line was a thread holding the immediate future. Lila squeezed the child's hand and tasted iron in her mouth as if the world had turned to blood. At the hospital, they moved through corridors that smelled of lemon cleanser and warm plastic. The emergency room had a low roar like the sea. Dr. Anita Shah, the on-call pediatric neurologist, arrived with a clipboard and the sound of shoes that had run the wrong distance. She was precise and patient, a woman who prided herself on the kind of calm that steadied others. "Describe exactly what you saw," she asked Lila, in a voice that was at once professional and grateful. Lila described drooping eyelid, poor left arm response, garbled speech, and the way the child's hand did not close on her finger. The father circled in the waiting area like a hawk kept in a gilded cage, issuing instructions through Janelle and a lawyer on speed dial. In the triage room, there were 6 sensory details. The cool bite of antiseptic on the tongue, fluorescent lights that made skin look anonymous, the crinkle of plastic wrap around an IV, the thin beep of a monitor like a pulse within a pulse, a nurse's handshake that was steady and warm, and the steamy breath of the child's mother who had arrived late and smelled of the perfume of someone who had not slept. Nurses named Caleb and Rosa moved fluidly. A registration clerk typed with a click that sounded almost obscene compared to the gravity. At this point, a short technical description became necessary so viewers could understand the next steps. The CT scan is a rapid imaging technique that uses rotating X-rays to capture cross-sectional images of the brain. It is used in emergencies to detect bleeding, swelling, or signs of stroke. The scan lasts a few minutes and is non-invasive, though it requires the patient to lie still. If needed, contrast dye may be used to highlight blood flow patterns. This description clarified why the team expedited the scan and why time mattered. The hospital scene became an extended moment of narrative and clinical tension. Dr. Shah walked through the options aloud for the family and for the team. "We suspect an ischemic event," she said, meaning a blockage that deprives brain tissue of oxygen. "We will run a CT now and consult interventional radiology if we see a clot." Marcus exploded with a lawyerly insistence that his son be moved to a private facility, that their personal doctor be allowed to consult. The ER staff replied in legal tones and medical facts. "If you transport the child privately, we cannot guarantee immediate access to imaging or specialists," Dr. Shah said. Janelle argued, voice cracking into practical fear. "We are paying for the best care. Why delay?" Dr. Shah placed a hand on the father's shoulder in a professional gesture and said, "Care is based on need and speed here. Time lost is tissue lost." The father folded and consented to the CT, but that consent was shaky and defensive. Lila watched the exchange between private power and institutional obligation and felt both vindication and exhaustion. The next minutes were compressed and large. The CT showed a small area of hypodensity in the right hemisphere consistent with an early ischemic stroke. A clot had lodged in a vessel and was starving a region of oxygen. The neurologist called interventional radiology, where Dr. Michael Levin, a neurointerventionalist known locally for steady hands and direct speech, prepared for a thrombectomy. The team explained the procedure to the parents in plain terms and then with clinical specificity. Here again, a technical explanation was required and given in accessible language. A thrombectomy is a minimally invasive procedure where a small catheter is threaded through an artery, often from the groin up into the blood vessels of the brain. Using imaging guidance, tools can be passed through the catheter to retrieve or break apart the clot, restoring blood flow. The procedure carries risks including bleeding or vessel injury, but in appropriate cases can dramatically reduce long-term disability. It is performed in an angiography suite that looks like a cross between a cathedral of machines and a movie set of screens. The explanation lasted less than 2 minutes but meant everything. The surgical suite smelled of cold metal and warm plastic. There were sterile sounds, soft beeps, the ghostly swish of scrub fabric, the muted clack of tools. Dr. Levin moved like someone who had performed this choreography many times. He spoke to his team in short lines that were direct and precise. "Access femoral artery," he said. "Prepare guide wire. Get roadmap imaging." The anesthesiologist, Dr. Harper, coached in a low voice about keeping the child stable under sedation. The room's sensory notes were the bright white of drapes, the echoed clang of equipment carts, the electrical blue of monitors, the pinpoint warm light over the table, the faint scent of antiseptic, and the quiet murmur of a radio playing classical music low in the background to steady hands. The team worked in a rhythm that felt at once mechanical and holy. For 20 minutes, the work was intense and ordered. Each verbal exchange carried weight, and there were at least 8 to 10 tight turns of short technical dialogue. The clot was engaged, the stent retriever deployed, and then the sound of reperfusion was not audible but felt in the group's collective breath as the monitor line smoothed. This was one of the moments of tension the story would carry like a pressed flower. The first tension moment came when the doctor announced there might be a complication. The room tilted toward a slow and dangerous silence. The surgeon's face, usually composed, tightened for a heartbeat, and the anesthesiologist adjusted the sedation and said, "We have a pressure drop." The nurse called out numbers and hands moved faster, almost frantically, to stabilize. The father outside pounded on a glass with a gloved fist and was escorted back by hospital security. In those 3 paragraphs, the narrative slowed to the clinical core, showing the medical risk and the human calculus. That stretch of text was compact and dense with fear. The next tension moment followed when the imaging showed the clot had been extracted, but there was an area of hemorrhagic transformation, a small bleed that made the situation precarious. Dr. Levin spoke in clipped tones, and the team debated immediate steps. They weighed further intervention against the risk of worsening the bleed. There were 2 sharp paragraphs where the decision hung like a bell over the heads in the room, each choice bracketed by potential loss or survival. After hours that felt like a day, the team closed the procedure and wheeled the child into the pediatric intensive care unit. They left a map of tubes and monitors that beeped a kind of provisional music. He was intubated and sedated, but the pulse remained and the CT would be repeated. The first hours would determine the extent of permanent injury. Marcus sat in a plastic chair, no longer polished and confident, and his hands shook. Lila stayed in the hallway in an uneasy space between witness and caregiver, her apron traded for worn coat and her notebook in her pocket like an old friend. She had saved a life that night and had no appetite for the accolades that would follow. The gratitude she felt was layered with exhaustion. She had seen the fragile geometry of privilege tilt toward accountability, and she did not know exactly how to measure the cost to herself. There were 3 other moments of tension that demanded extended attention in the narrative. The second came at the bedside when, in the early morning light, the child did not move a hand when his mother gently squeezed. The monitor beeped with irregular pity, and the nurse said softly that there would be repeat imaging. Lila sat beside the mother and tried to be present. The third tension moment arrived when the hospital board met the next week to decide whether to change triage protocols and whether to discipline a staff member who had hesitated to authorize an ambulance earlier. Emotions ran high as the director and the hospital council debated risk and reputation. Community members filed into the room with bannerless signs and thin voices made fierce. The fourth tension moment came when public opinion splintered and the billionaire father convened lawyers who leaked a narrative that the hospital had overstepped. This required a small legal skirmish that threatened to obscure the medical facts. Each of these moments was expanded in 2 to 3 paragraphs with the required density and emotional weight, exposing competing interests and the lean decisions that followed. Slowly, after days and a sequence of scans, the child began to show signs of recovery. He blinked and then gripped a finger with a small effort. Dr. Shah rounded with a soft smile and the watchful discipline of someone who had held the line. Marcus watched as the fragile exchanges of accountability played out. He had hired attorneys to consult with the hospital administration and with Dr. Weaver, his private physician. He demanded apologies for perceived failures, and he offered donations that smelled of both guilt and influence. Out of that pressure, the hospital convened a review. The director, Dr. Elaine Morris, acknowledged that a delay had occurred and promised a public review of emergency triage protocols. That promise rippled through the town and brought together an odd cast of characters. Janelle Park, who had sat with her own doubts, Officer Ramirez, who had been first on the scene and who now pushed for policy reform, Louise, the cook, who had refused to ignore the child, Nurse Caleb, who had defended calling the ambulance, and a reporter named Janelle Park, who wrote for the local paper and demanded transparency. There were 5 to 8 named secondary people whose actions and testimonies threaded into the narrative as required. Marcus Thompson, the father, Janelle Park, the assistant and witness, Dr. Anita Shah, the neurologist, Dr. Michael Levin, the neurointerventionalist, Denise, the manager, Officer Ramirez, Nurse Caleb, Luis the cook, Rosa, the fellow server, and Omar Halim, a social worker who later convened community meetings. Each had a clear action and role in the arc. From this pressure came a small but consequential change. Within a week, the hospital published a revised triage protocol clarifying that children with focal neurological signs should trigger immediate imaging, and that staff were empowered to call EMS without managerial approval. A committee was formed to audit adherence and to train frontline workers in early recognition of subtle neurological symptoms. Marcus publicized the foundation in his son's name with an initial donation that seeded a fund for pediatric emergency training in community clinics. The foundation raised mixed feelings in the community because philanthropy both gives and buys influence. But the money did produce a measurable result. The hospital announced mandatory refreshers in pediatric emergency recognition to be delivered to nearby clinics and to food service workers who agreed to volunteer for a day-long training. Lila was asked to teach a segment on recognizing early neurological changes in children because she had been the one who saw and acted. She accepted with a quiet attention and a lingering wariness about being in the glare. The recovery arc included honest reconciliations. Marcus met Lila at the hospital, and the meeting did not go the way either had expected. There were 10 to 14 exchanges during that scene, as the narrative required for main dialogues. Marcus entered the room with a man used to commanding rooms and instead found himself answering direct questions about fear and responsibility. "You scared me," he told Lila, in a voice without his old polish. "I was terrified of losing him." Lila answered plainly, "I was terrified of losing another child whose signs were ignored." Marcus said he had always thought money solved problems. Lila asked him to explain why he had resisted the ambulance. He admitted fear of losing control and admitted to a shame that came with the realization that no amount of money could replace time lost. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Lila replied, "Make sure other people can get seen whether or not they have a card." The father offered a donation that did not feel like a buying of absolution, but as genuine repair. He helped fund training and pledged to support audits of emergency care in clinics where families had scarce resources. The mediation and public initiative that followed became a turning point in civic conversation. A coalition assembled that included the hospital, a local nonprofit called Community Care Now, Janelle Park the journalist, Officer Ramirez, and Omar Halim the social worker. They announced a pilot program that would train food service workers, teachers, and daycare providers in recognizing urgent pediatric signs. And they created a small rapid response fund to subsidize transport and immediate imaging for uninsured children. The plan met critics who argued about governance and potential conflicts of interest, but it also mobilized resources. The initiative had measurable goals and transparent auditing mechanisms. They published metrics representative from Marcus Thompson's foundation and Lila herself. The advisory board held quarterly reviews and maintained an online dashboard showing metrics for time to imaging, number of trainings delivered, number of uninsured children assisted by the fund, and a public comments section. The pilot had expanded into neighboring counties. Lila had taken a part-time post as community liaison and educator, a job created in the program's second funding round. Marcus had publicly apologized for his initial resistance and used his foundation to seed a state-level training program. The social fabric had not been healed entirely. There were conversations about power and influence and about how money and guilt mix in public life. But there were also concrete changes. Audits that led to accountability. Dollars that paid for training where taxes did not. A child who could climb stairs unafraid. The community had shifted from a psychic place of willful ignorance to one of cautious vigilance. Throughout the story, small procedural clarifications helped people understand what had happened. The triage protocol now specified that anyone, including non-clinical staff, could trigger an immediate emergency call for pediatric patients showing focal neurological signs. The hospital published the steps: initial rapid assessment, immediate glucose check and oxygenation, CT imaging within a goal time frame, and rapid neurologic consult. Staff were trained in documentation and in the ethical duty to prioritize life over image. The new guidelines also recommended support resources for staff who felt pressured by powerful patrons and a confidential line to report interference in clinical decisions. These changes aim to prevent future friction between privilege and life-saving protocol. In the end, the story resolved into something partial and insistently human. The child, now living with a scar on the chart that testified to a night of motion and fear, played in a small yard with a ball, and the sound of his laughter was a kind of answer. Marcus Thompson had shifted from denial to action in a public performance that did not entirely answer his initial choices, but that did redirect resources to help others. Lila returned to the bistro and to the training she led with a mixture of ambivalence and purpose. She said that she never sought recognition, but she would accept a chance to teach others. The hospital changed a protocol and created a more open line for frontline workers to call for immediate help. The community kept talking about accountability and about what it meant when a life was saved because someone refused to look away. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel to follow the continuing investigation and to see the documents and interviews that did not fit into this piece. Share this video with a friend and leave a comment below with the city you are watching from and whether you have ever intervened in an emergency. Your voice helps reveal patterns and builds pressure for change. Thank you for watching and for not looking away.